A basic knowledge about the slope and elasticity of IS and LM curves is very essential to suggest and evaluate the effectiveness of monetary and fiscal policies. In this tutorial, we shall deal with the IS curve. First, we shall justify the downward slope of the IS curve. In simple terms, IS curve slopes downward because of the negative relation between interest and investment. The following example will help you to understand this. Look at figure 1. Interest falls from 5% to 4%. Investment increases from 50 rupees to 55 rupees, a net increase of 5 rupees. How does this become a reason for downward sloping of the IS curve? Look at figure 2. Increase in investment shifts the aggregate demand curve C plus I upward to C plus I1. The multiplier K is 2. The net increase in investment 5 rupees increases the income by multiplier times, that is 2 times 5, 10 rupees. The initial equilibrium income is 120 rupees. The new equilibrium income is 120 plus 10, 130 rupees. The income interest combination 125 and 134 are on the downward sloping IS curve shown in figure 3. These points are deduced from the investment function and the goods market equilibrium. Fall in the interest increases investment. Increases in investment shifts the aggregate demand curve upward. Increase in aggregate demand increases the income. Thus, higher income is associated with lower interest. The reverse is equally true. Good. At the very outset, let me tell you that slope and elasticity of IS curve depend on 1. Elasticity of investment curve and 2. The size of the multiplier. We shall turn to the factors that determine the nature of slope. Relatively steep or relatively flat. The first factor is elasticity of investment curve. Let us make use of the previous example. When the interest falls from 5% to 4%, the percentage fall in interest is 20%. Investment increases from 50 rupees to 55 rupees. The percentage increase in investment is 10%. Percentage fall in interest 20% is greater than percentage increase in income 10%. Investment curve is relatively steep and inelastic. If it is so, the IS curve is also relatively steep and relatively inelastic. How? We shall use the same example. Look at figure 3. Here also, the percentage decrease in interest is 20%. The percentage increase in income, when the income increases from 120 rupees to 130 rupees, is 8%. Percentage fall in interest 20% is greater than percentage increase in income 8%. IS curve is relatively steep and less elastic. Because the investment curve is relatively steep and less elastic. Okay. If investment curve is elastic, the IS curve also will be elastic and relatively flat. Let me present the same graph with some changes. The initial values are the same. Value of multiplier K is 2. Initial income 120 rupees. Interest falls from 5% to 4%. Percentage fall in interest is 20%. I have introduced change in investment. After a fall in interest, the investment increases from 50 rupees to 70 rupees. Percentage increase in investment is 40%. A small percentage fall in interest, 20%, causes a large percentage increase in investment, 40%. The investment curve I is more elastic. It is relatively flat. Okay. Look at figure 2. The net increase in investment, 20 rupees, shifts the aggregate demand curve from C plus I to C plus I1. Initial income 120 rupees increases multiplier times increase in investment. 2 times 20, 40 rupees. New income is 120 plus 40, 160 rupees. The income interest combinations 125 and 164 are points on the IS curve. The new curve is relatively flat. For 20% fall in interest, income increases by 33%. IS curve is also relatively flat and relatively elastic. Thus, one of the determinants of the slope and elasticity of the IS curve is the slope and elasticity of the investment curve. Okay. The second factor that determines the slope of the IS curve is multiplier. Smaller the value of multiplier, IS curve is relatively inelastic and steep. Look at this graph. This is the same graph which I have displayed first. The multiplier value is 2. The size of multiplier is small. The IS curve is relatively inelastic. It is relatively steep because the size of the multiplier is small. Higher the value of multiplier, IS curve is relatively elastic and flat. Look at figure 1. No change in investment function. In our present example, the size of the multiplier is 8. Look at figure 2. The net increase in investment, 5 rupees, shifts the aggregate demand curve upward. But income increases by multiplier times the increase in investment. 5 times 8, 40 rupees. New income is 120 rupees plus 40, 160 rupees. The income interest combinations 125 and 164 are points on the IS curve. Look at the shape of the IS curve. Though the investment curve is relatively steep and relatively inelastic, IS curve is relatively flat and relatively elastic. Relative flatness and relatively elastic IS curve is due to the size of the multiplier. Okay. Now, regarding the slope, these are our findings. 1. If investment curve is relatively inelastic, IS curve is relatively steep. 2. If investment curve is relatively elastic, IS curve is relatively flat. 3. If value of multiplier is small, IS curve is relatively steep. 4. If value of multiplier is large, IS curve is relatively flat. Now, regarding the elasticity, these are our findings. 1. If investment curve is relatively inelastic, IS curve is also relatively inelastic. 2. If investment curve is relatively elastic, IS curve is also relatively elastic. 3. If the value of multiplier is small, IS curve is relatively inelastic. 4. If value of multiplier is large, IS curve is relatively elastic. Our lesson ends here. Vanakkam. We shall meet again.